Danger has a way of finding those who wander the wild frontier, and sometimes fate steps in when least expected. Out on the endless plains and rugged mesas of the American West, a quiet cowboy named James Caldwell stumbles upon a horrifying sight, a young native girl alone and cornered by a ravenous wolf pack. With courage forged by his lonely days on the range, James intervenes, unaware that this single, selfless act will upend his life, spark a chain of astonishing events, and connect him to her proud tribe in ways he could never have imagined. Fate is calling. Will you follow James Jim? Caldwell had grown used to the hush of the western night. He'd spent so many years on these plains that he could read the land like scripture. Each rustle of grass, each creak of a distant cottonwood, and every shift of the warm, dry wind told him something about the world around him. Though the territory seemed empty, to most James felt it bursting with life and possibility. He rarely missed a thing. He was a tall man, with lean muscle that came from honest labor and long rides under a punishing sun. His skin was tanned to a rich bronze, his sandy hair permanently dusted from trail dirt, and his light gray eyes always a little narrowed against the glare. He wore a battered brown hat and a threadbare duster that had once been black, but was now faded to a mottled charcoal. Having fought in the cavalry many years prior, James had grown disillusioned with endless conflict. The West offered him a chance at a new life, away from the thunder of gunfire and the terror of battle. In late autumn of 1876, he found himself traveling through a region not far from the frontier settlement of Dustin Falls. He had a small shack of a ranch to call home in the foothills, but that morning he'd driven a few head of cattle out onto better grass. The sun had begun its slow arc across a pastel sky when he decided to press on for the day, searching for new watering holes. The endless desert plains shimmered with heat. For hours he saw nothing but the mesquite brush, the occasional coyote and hawks circling overhead in search of prey. Then as dusk approached and the air cooled, he heard something. A faint chorus of growling, snarling and yipping coming from behind a small stand of juniper. It was an unholy sound that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Instinct took over. James drew his worn pistol and snapped the reins of his horse, Stormcloud urging the mare toward the noise. The scene that unfurled made his blood run cold. A girl, a child of maybe 10 or 11, small in stature, her long black hair in tangles crouched behind a rock. A pack of 4 wolves, scrawny from the season's hardships, had surrounded her. Their lips curled back in snarls, saliva dripping from fangs that flashed dully in the fading light. James took in the girl's trembling form. She wore buckskin clothing, the kind that many local tribes fashioned for themselves. He wondered if she might be Apache, or from the Navajo tribe, or perhaps from a smaller band that roamed these parts. The reason didn't matter, she was alone, and the wolves were closing in. Without hesitation, he fired a shot into the air, a crack that echoed across the barren land. The wolves paused and turned disoriented for a split second, then scattered a few paces away. 3 ran off immediately. 1 lingered growling as though deciding whether to charge James or flee. James shouted "Hia" and fired another shot near the creature's paws. The final wolf yelped and slunk off to rejoin its pack lost somewhere among the desert shadows. The girl sat motionless, eyes wide. James approached slowly, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He slipped his gun back into the holster, raised both hands to show he meant no harm, and spoke softly. Though James was no stranger to the region's native people, he didn't know her language, so he offered a gesture, tapping his chest and offering a small bow. Her lips parted in silent fear. "You're all right, Miss James," said low and reassuring. "No wolves are gonna bother you now." He dismounted and knelt next to her. She looked malnourished, her cheeks sunken, her eyes large, reflecting both terror and exhaustion. He dug into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen of water. Offering it carefully, James watched relief flicker across her face as she drank. He studied her more closely. She had bruises on her arms and scrapes on her knees. Tattered moccasins and a torn strip of cloth around her waist indicated she'd traveled through harsh terrain. The question that haunted him was, why was she alone? Where was her family? Darkness was coming fast, and James knew the night air would bring bitter cold. He could not in good conscience leave her on her own. Gently he guided her toward his horse, speaking in calm, slow words, and hoping she might catch his meaning. She seemed to understand. Carefully, he lifted her onto Stormcloud's back. She barely weighed more than a bundle of reeds. "Let's get you somewhere safe," he whispered, mounting up behind her. "I reckon we'll figure out the rest tomorrow." They headed north, leaving the wolves and the wide plain behind. James's small ranch house stood alone against the backdrop of distant mountains. It wasn't much, just a single-room cabin, with a modest lean-to stable, a little corral, and a well. A few lanterns lit the interior, casting flickering shadows against the rough-hewn walls. He helped the girl dismount and led her inside. The girl clung to the edge of his coat as he placed a fresh log on the fire, warming up the space. She sat gingerly on a stool. James rummaged in a trunk for an old wool blanket, then carefully wrapped it around her shoulders. "Are you hungry?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. Her eyes lit up with urgency. He placed a bowl of leftover stew near her. She studied him warily, then picked up the wooden spoon and ate in small, delicate mouthfuls. He noticed her glancing around, cautious, as if expecting someone to appear and punish her for accepting his help. The stew vanished quickly. James handed her a tin cup of water. Then he tried to glean any information about her origins, but she spoke in halting words that he couldn't piece together into any meaning. She pointed east, then south, then folded her arms over her chest, as though hugging herself in fear. James nodded, letting her know he was listening, although he wasn't sure how to respond. All the while she trembled, her eyes shining with a mixture of fatigue and sorrow. Eventually she fell asleep by the fire, the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. James lowered the lantern flame and stared at the tiny figure. He was a man used to traveling alone, but his heart ached for the girl. She was so vulnerable, an echo of countless tragedies the West had a habit of producing. The question gnawed at him. What if the wolves weren't the only danger out there for her? He scratched at the stubble on his chin and sighed. There was nothing to be done tonight. He'd try to find someone who recognized her tomorrow. Perhaps some folks in Dustin Falls would know which local band of natives she belonged to. Taking off his boots, James stretched out on a cot in the corner. He listened to the wind's lonely howl outside, a sound that had once comforted him, but now all he felt was worry. If the girl's family was out there searching for her, they'd be frantic. If something had happened to them, well, that thought weighed heavy. Eventually, as the embers in the fireplace glowed low, exhaustion claimed him. At dawn, the girl woke with a start and looked around, momentarily confused. James greeted her with a bowl of oatmeal sweetened with a little sugar. She devoured it and gave a timid smile, the first sign of trust he'd seen on her face. "Name James?" asked softly, tapping his chest. "I'm James." She hesitated, then spoke a word he couldn't quite make out. He repeated it, trying to shape his mouth the way she had. She giggled at his mispronunciation, but seemed pleased he was trying. After a few attempts, it sounded like Neol, or perhaps Neola, though James wasn't certain if it was her name or another word entirely. In any case, he decided to call her Neol, repeating it gently until she nodded, apparently satisfied. A plan formed in James's mind. He would take Neol to Dustin Falls. The town's general store was run by an older couple named Sadie and Benjamin Pettigrew. Ben had once served as a scout for the army and spoke a few native dialects. If anyone around these parts could help identify Niol's tribe, it would be him. Then maybe they could find her family. James saddled Stormcloud, bundling Niol in a thicker coat he'd stored away. The child clung to him tightly as they set off on the 2-hour ride to Dustin Falls. The terrain was mostly scrubland, dotted with shrubs and the occasional cactus or stunted juniper. Before long, the outlines of the town came into view, a handful of dusty buildings huddled against the wide sky. Dustin Falls was one of those frontier settlements that had sprung up around a small spring. It had a church, a sheriff's office, a saloon, a boarding house, a livery stable, and the indispensable general store. The main thoroughfare was unpaved, and the wind kicked up small cyclones of sand. A few local ranchers and travelers bustled about. As James rode in, he felt the familiar stares. Townsfolk rarely saw a man arrive with a native child. Old Man Foster, who kept watch from his rocking chair on the hotel's porch, stood up, scowling. A couple of ranch hands stopped mid-conversation to watch them pass. James ignored them. He had no time for gossip or rumors. He dismounted in front of Pettigrew's general store. The store itself was a sturdy wooden structure with wide windows displaying sacks of flour, glass jars of penny candy, and bolts of cloth. He lifted Neol from the horse and led her inside. The shop smelled of kerosene-fresh coffee and leather. As the bell over the door rang, Sadie Pettigrew appeared short and spry in a faded cotton dress. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled into a loose bun. "Well, James Caldwell," she said. "We haven't seen you in quite some time." "Who's this morning, Sadie?" James said, tipping his hat. "Is Ben around?" Sadie's gaze flicked to the girl who hovered by James's side, partially hiding behind his leg. Sadie gave a kind smile. "He's in the back storeroom inventorying. Go on through." James gently nudged Neol forward as they made their way around a wall stacked high with canned goods. In the back, they found Benjamin Pettigrew, a tall, lanky man with wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose. He seemed engrossed in a ledger. Ben James greeted. "I need a bit of help." Benjamin glanced up. A look of surprise crossed his face when he saw Neol. "Well, You've got a young companion, James." "What happened?" Briefly. James recounted the previous evening's events, the wolves, the rescue, the overnight stay. Ben listened intently, adjusting his spectacles. He then knelt in front of Neol, speaking slowly in a language James didn't recognize. She watched him warily at first, but after a few attempts she answered in short phrases. A halting conversation ensued, with the occasional nod and confused shake of her head. Finally Ben stood. "Her name is indeed Neol, which can mean wind in some dialects. She's from a small band, likely Apache, though her accent suggests she might have spent time around the Navajo as well. She's quite distressed. Says her mother is gone, father is... Well, she uses a phrase that might mean missing or taken. I'm not entirely certain. Something about a group of men raiding their camp." Ben's brow furrowed. She may be the only survivor. She's certainly traumatized. James felt a twinge of anger. The West was full of such tragedies, but hearing it firsthand made his stomach turn. I need to figure out how to help her find her people. Well, Ben said, scratching his head. We've had a few visitors from local tribes pass through. The next time they come, we might ask them. Or you could try finding the old man named Taza, who sets up a booth outside the saloon. He's an itinerant trader, but he's known to have connections with several Apache clans. James glanced at Niol, who looked lost. Thank you, Ben. I'll do that. I appreciate it. Sadie appeared, pressing a small bag of dried fruit and nuts into Niol's hands. It's not much, sweetheart, but here for you. With that, James guided the girl outside again. She clutched the small gift, offering Sadie a shy smile. The Pettigrews waved them off. As they stepped onto the main street, an uneasy hush spread among the townsfolk. James could feel the tension. For years, local ranchers had clashed with native tribes over territory and resources. Though many people in Dustin Falls tried to live peaceably, old fears died hard. Some stared at Niol with suspicion, as if she were a harbinger of trouble. James pretended not to notice, as he led Niol to the far side of town, to the area near the saloon. A man named Taza was rumored to set up a small stall where he sold beads, herbs, and intricately woven blankets. It was a corner where outliers often gathered. They found Taza easily enough, a short man with leathery skin hair streaked with grey, wearing a mix of frontier clothing and traditional garb. He eyed James and Niol with curiosity as they approached. James quickly explained the situation. Taza spoke a few words to Niol in another dialect. She nodded vigorously, tears welling in her eyes. Taza's expression became grave. Her family. They were attacked, he told James. Men with rifles came to their camp. They took some people, killed others. She doesn't know if anyone survived. Taza reached out to gently stroke her hair. She's a brave child, but she's seen great horror. James felt fury spike inside him. This was the sort of brutality he'd witnessed before, and he'd left the cavalry, partly because he couldn't stomach the mindless violence it sometimes inflicted on native communities. I have to help her, James, said voice shaking slightly. Is there a place she might have relatives? Taza sighed. There is talk of a camp in the deep canyons, south of here, near the Painted Rock Mesa. Some survivors of raids gather there. It's a dangerous journey if you don't know the land. He studied James carefully. But perhaps we can arrange something. Just then the sound of horses clopping drew their attention. A group of armed men rode into the corner of the street. Local ranchers, it appeared, led by a tall figure with a bushy mustache. The man was Jethro Wilcox, an aggressive ranch boss known for his dislike of Injuns, as he derisively called them. He reined in his horse sharply. What's this about, Caldwell? Wilcox demanded, glaring at Niol and Taza. Bringing trouble into town, are we? James felt his hand tighten into a fist, but he kept himself collected. It's no trouble, Wilcox, just a child in need. None of your concern. Wilcox spat in the dirt. Anything to do with them is my concern. I'm losing cattle to rustlers and might be them Apaches for all I know. A child like that. She's the spawn of thieves. You best be careful or you'll find a knife in your back someday. Anger flared in James's eyes, but Taza placed a calming hand on his arm. James took a breath, forcing himself to remain civil in front of the townsfolk who'd begun to gather. You're barking up the wrong tree, James said evenly. And you're not half the around to here, Wilcox sneered. "You'll regret meddling, Caldwell." With that, he kicked his horse's flanks and rode off, leading his scowling men away. Niol's small hand clutched James's fingers. He sensed her trembling. She must have felt the hatred emanating from Wilcox. Taza watched them depart, shaking his head. "Cowardly men all fear and anger," Taza said softly. "Be careful, James Caldwell. When ignorance meets vengeance, it breeds violence." Despite the tension in town, James resolved to press on. He made a decision right then and there. He would accompany Taza on a journey to Painted Rock Mesa to see if they could find any sign of Niol's relatives or others who had survived. It was the decent thing to do. And though James had seen enough bloodshed in his life, he couldn't turn a blind eye to a frightened child with no one else. That afternoon, Taza and James gathered supplies from Pettigrew's store, water provisions, extra ammunition. Sadie Pettigrew insisted on giving them warm blankets, just in case. Then with Niol riding in front of James on Stormcloud, and Taza astride a stocky Mustang, they headed south. The landscape changed as they traveled. Rolling plains gave way to scattered rock formations, deep gulches, and hidden canyons. Though it was autumn, the sun still blazed high, and the air felt heavy. They rode for hours, speaking little, letting the hoofbeats fill the silence. Niol dozed off against James's chest, at times roused only by the jostle of the trail. By nightfall, Taza led them to a small alcove near a sandstone cliff where they could make camp. A cluster of pinyon pines offered some shelter from the wind. They tied up the horses and built a modest fire. Over a pot of beans, Taza spoke quietly to Niol, gleaning more details about her ordeal. James watched her face flicker with pain as she answered Taza's questions. Occasionally, Taza would shake his head, anger shining in his eyes. When Taza finished, he turned to James. "She says men in blue coats attacked her village." His voice was grim. "Army men, maybe, or cavalry scouts. She's not certain if they were official soldiers or outlaws wearing stolen uniforms. They fired rifles, took some captives, her father, she believes, among them, and killed others. She ran, got lost. That's when you found her." James felt ill. He remembered the time he'd served in the cavalry, how he'd witnessed questionable raids on native camps. Could it be the army was still carrying out such campaigns? Or had criminals simply stolen uniforms to disguise themselves? Either scenario was a nightmare. He closed his eyes, recalling the day he'd resigned his post because of a brutal assault on a village that still haunted him. "We'll figure it out," James whispered. "If Painted Rock Mesa is a gathering place, maybe someone there knows more, or maybe her father escaped to that area." Taza nodded, stirring the fire. Niol listened, expression serious. Though she didn't understand all their English, she seemed to sense the gravity of the conversation. They bedded down under the star-filled sky, an uneasy tension coiling in James's chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that bigger troubles awaited them. 2 more days of travel led them deeper into canyon country. The towering walls of red and ochre stone seemed to swallow them. Occasionally, Taza would stop at high vantage points to scan the horizon. They passed silent buttes and narrow washes. Sometimes they saw fresh footprints or old campfires, but no sign of a large group. On the afternoon of the second day, they reached Painted Rock Mesa, an immense table of stone that rose from the desert floor. Its sides were streaked with mineral deposits in shades of orange, blue, and purple, giving it a surreal glow in the changing light. Taza gestured for them to dismount and proceed quietly. He'd heard rumors of an encampment hidden in the folds of the canyons near the mesa's base. They led the horses carefully through a narrow slot canyon. The walls loomed so close that James could reach out and brush them with both hands. After nearly an hour of creeping through this labyrinth, they emerged into a broad clearing, and there, partially concealed behind large boulders, were a few small huts made from brush and hides. Smoke curled from a couple of fires, and James spotted figures moving among the shadows. As soon as they appeared, there were shouts. Men and women darted for cover, bows and arrows at the ready. Taza raised both hands, calling out in a dialect James couldn't understand. James did the same, though he felt Niall trembling. She leaned toward him, eyes scanning the unfamiliar faces. Then a woman stepped forward, her face painted with white and red lines. She spoke in a rapid burst, looking straight at Niall. Niall answered quietly, stepping away from James to approach the woman. The tension broke almost immediately as the woman swept her into an embrace. James heard weeping and gasps from the group that had gathered. Taza translated for James, his voice choked with emotion. "This woman is Niall's aunt. She and a few other survivors fled here after the raid. They believed Niall was taken or dead. They're overwhelmed with relief to see her alive." James exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. A wave of relief also swept through him. At the very least, the child had found kin. They were beckoned inside the small encampment. The huts were modest, made of woven reeds, and covered with hides to block the wind. A central fire pit glowed in the fading daylight. The tribe's leader, an elderly man with a lined face and clouded eyes, sat cross-legged near the fire. He studied James with a neutral gaze. Then Taza explained the story of how James had rescued Niall from wolves and traveled south to bring her here. When Taza finished, the elder nodded gravely as though acknowledging a debt. James also learned grim news. Most of the band's able-bodied men had been scattered, captured, or killed in the raid. Niall's father was among the missing. The group at Painted Rock Mesa was mostly women, children, and a few elders. They had little food and lived in constant fear of discovery by the men who had attacked them. That night, they shared a simple meal. Niall huddled with her aunt, occasionally glancing at James and offering a shy smile. For James, the sight was heartening, a far cry from that desperate scene in the wilderness. But heartbreak and uncertainty lingered. If her father was still alive, he could be in captivity somewhere or wandering lost. The West was vast, and the cavalry and the outlaws could be anywhere. Early the next morning, Taza told James that a scouting party from the group wanted to investigate the site of the raid. If they found tracks or signs, perhaps they could rescue any prisoners still alive. James felt a surge of determination. He had once been skilled at tracking and infiltration. Perhaps he could put those skills to good use. Niall's aunt insisted on joining them, but the elder requested that she remain behind. Niall needed her, and the aunt was one of the few able to protect the children at Painted Rock Mesa. After a tearful goodbye, Taza, James, and two young warriors set off. They headed north, guided by the warriors' memory of their original camp's location. The desert seemed endless, a rolling sea of sandy washes and rugged terrain. James rode with a keen eye, scanning for any sign, hoofprints, broken branches, or the faintest remains of a campsite. At midday, they smelled something foul on the wind, a stench of decay. The warriors looked grim, and soon they found the source, the remnants of the band's old encampment. It was deserted, half-burned. Scattered blankets and broken pottery lay about, and near the ashes of campfires, the bodies of those who hadn't escaped. James removed his hat, feeling numb. One of the warriors clenched his fists, tears glinting in his eyes. They walked the perimeter, searching for clues. Everywhere they turned, they found more horrors, bullet casings strewn about footprints from horses with army regulation shoes and scraps of dark blue fabric snagged on a jagged rock. One of the warriors quietly muttered a prayer over the remains. Taza conferred with them, pointing out deeper wagon tracks that led away from the site. James examined them more closely. They seemed fresh enough, heading toward the east, winding between rocky outcrops. "Looks like they took some captives that way," James said. Taza nodded solemnly. The group followed the tracks for several miles until they reached a small box canyon. The wagon ruts disappeared into a narrow passage. Carefully, they proceeded on foot, leaving the horses in a hidden spot. The canyon walls were tall and close, the sunlight only faintly reaching the bottom. Taza and James exchanged a look. If an ambush were waiting, they'd be trapped. But they pressed on. At the canyon's bend, they heard low voices echoing off the rock. The group crept closer. Peering around a stone outcropping, they beheld a disturbing sight, a makeshift camp of about a dozen men. Some wore mismatched pieces of what appeared to be cavalry uniforms. Others sported tattered civilian clothes. James realized these were likely outlaws pretending to be soldiers, or possibly deserters from the army turned renegade. They had a handful of native prisoners, 2 men, an older woman, and a teenage boy huddled and bound near a smoldering fire. The prisoners looked weak and battered. James's blood simmered. This was exactly the kind of cruelty he had hoped never to witness again. Taza's jaw tightened as he recognized some of the faces of the captives. One of the 2 native men, hunched over with lash marks on his back, could well be Nyol's father, though from this distance, James couldn't be certain. The 4 of them, James, Taza, and the 2 warriors, quickly pulled back, conferring in hushed tones. Storming the camp head-on was suicide. They were outnumbered, and the outlaws were armed with rifles. If they could wait until nightfall, perhaps they could stage a covert rescue. Time, however, might be running out for the prisoners. "Let's do this carefully," James whispered. "We'll circle around and watch for an opening. When they're asleep or distracted, we strike." Taza agreed. Although the warriors looked restless, eager for vengeance, they had to wait for the right moment. Night descended slowly. The outlaws sat around, drinking, laughing raucously, and occasionally tormenting the prisoners by kicking dirt on them or shouting threats. James, Taza, and the warriors observed from behind a large boulder, hearts pounding. Eventually, the men settled into a drunken stupor. The faint glow of lanterns dotted the campsite. Now was their chance. James signaled to the others. Taza and 1 warrior would approach from the left side to cut the prisoners' bonds. James and the other warrior, armed with rifles, would cover them from a rocky ledge overhead if trouble started. It was slow going. Taza and the warrior removed their boots to move silently. James and his partner crept up a narrow path to the ledge. James's heart hammered in his chest, each footstep feeling too loud. He could smell the whiskey drifting from the outlaws below. From his vantage, James saw Taza slip toward the prisoners. The warrior with him produced a knife and began sawing at their bindings. An outlaw stirred nearby, half awake, and James raised his rifle, teeth clenched. He thought about the nightmares that had once haunted him after battles. This was no different, life and death in a single breath. The rope snapped. The captives were free but too weak to move quickly. Taza signaled for them to keep silent, helping them to their feet. At that moment, a second outlaw stood to relieve himself, stumbling near the group. Taza flattened himself against the shadows, but the man caught a glimpse of movement. He froze, then opened his mouth to shout, "Crack!" James fired a single shot, hitting the outlaw in the chest. The man slumped to the ground, never finishing his cry. Instantly, the camp exploded into chaos. The outlaws woke, scrambling for guns, cursing. "Go James," hissed, firing another shot at a figure lunging for a rifle. The warrior beside him loosed an arrow, catching a second outlaw in the thigh. Down below, Taza ducked behind a wagon, ushering the prisoners to safety. Gunfire erupted from the outlaws. Sparks lit the darkness. Bullets ricocheted off rocks near James's position. He rolled behind cover, reloading. The warrior with him darted to a better vantage, letting fly another arrow. One outlaw dropped with a scream, clutching his shoulder. "Cover me!" Taza shouted up at James. He dashed out with the freed prisoners, heading toward the passage. Another outlaw took aim at Taza's back, but James fired first, dropping the gunman. A flurry of muzzle flashes lit the canyon. Echoes boomed off the high walls. The two native warriors let out fierce war cries as they fired arrows from multiple angles, confusing the outlaws. Despite being outnumbered, James and his allies had the advantage of surprise and vantage. The outlaws were disorganized and drunk. A bullet whistled dangerously close to James's head, lodging in the rock behind him. He ducked, heart pounding, and returned fire. He saw at least 3 outlaws still standing, cursing in the gloom. Suddenly, a man wearing a cavalry jacket, likely their leader, emerged from the shadows. He leveled a rifle at Taza's back. James's stomach lurched. He took aim, but the angle was off. He couldn't get a clear shot without risking Taza. Before James could reposition, one of the young warriors vaulted over a boulder and tackled the outlaw leader. They tumbled into the dust, rolling and grappling. The outlaw leader swung the butt of his rifle, catching the warrior on the temple. The warrior went limp. Rage burned in James's chest. He took careful aim, waiting for the right moment. The outlaw raised his rifle to finish the unconscious warrior, but James's bullet struck first, hitting the outlaw square in the chest. The man's eyes widened in shock as he collapsed. Silence fell, broken only by ragged breathing and the crackle of a burning ember. The few remaining outlaws, wounded or terrified, fled into the darkness. James scrambled down from the ledge, nearly sliding on loose gravel. Taza knelt beside the unconscious warrior. The blow had drawn blood, but a quick examination showed he was still alive. The rescued captives clung to each other, trembling. One of them, the older woman, softly spoke Neol's father's name. James leaned in, scanning their faces. The battered man coughed, trying to focus. He was older than James had expected, but the resemblance to Neol was unmistakable. He had the same shape of eyes. Relief and heartbreak warred in James's mind. "We have to get them out of here," James said, quick before any stragglers regroup. Working efficiently, they gathered what they could from the outlaws' supplies: extra blankets, a little food, canteens of water. Taza and James helped the injured warrior onto a horse. Neol's father, too weak to walk unaided, was half carried, half lifted onto another. They fled the canyon, guided by the moonlight, hearts pounding as they left behind the bloody scene. The trip back to Painted Rock Mesa was grueling. The rescued prisoners were in terrible shape, dehydrated, wounded, traumatized. But they pressed on, spurred by the promise of safety. At dawn, they stumbled into the encampment, bringing joy to those who thought their loved ones dead. Neol's reunion with her father was a sight James would never forget. Though battered, the man still had enough strength to hold his daughter tight as she sobbed against his chest. Their tears mingled with relieved laughter. Others in the camp cried out in joy upon seeing their returned kin. The aunt collapsed with gratitude, hugging them both. Exhausted James sank to the ground near Taza. The young warrior he'd saved was being tended to by the tribe's healer, who praised James's sharp shooting. Taza placed a hand on James's shoulder. You have done a great deed for us." James shook his head. "They deserve their freedom. Every last one." He glanced at the battered father and daughter. A swirl of emotions came over him. Relief, sorrow for all they had endured, and a strange sense of hope. That evening, as the battered survivors rested, an elder of the band addressed James directly. Though his words were in Apache, Taza translated. "He says we owe you a debt. You came as a stranger, yet you fought like a brother to save our people. Such an act must be honored." James lowered his gaze, humbled. "I don't need any reward," he said. "Just to see them safe is enough." But the elder insisted. "You have risked your life. Our custom is to show gratitude. Soon you will see." Though James longed for peace, trouble often came unbidden. When the band learned about the outlaws' defeat, some worried that more would return seeking revenge. James felt compelled to warn Dustin Falls that a violent gang posed a threat to the region. After a few days of rest, once the freed captives had recovered enough to travel Taza, and James decided to go back to town. Niol didn't want James to leave, clinging to his hand. Through Taza's translation, she pleaded, "We want you to stay. You are part of us." James's heart clenched, but he knew he had obligations. With a soft smile, he promised to visit again. Niol's father eyes, still ringed with bruises, gave James a respectful nod. Their departure was bittersweet. James and Taza rode north, guided by the rising sun. The journey was calmer than the frantic escape before. They carried a sense of accomplishment, yet worry nagged at them. Who were those outlaws, exactly? Where had they gotten cavalry gear? Would they regroup? Upon arriving at Dustin Falls, they found the town on edge. Rumors had spread of an attack on a ranch outside the settlement. A few local ranch hands had been killed, stock stolen. Whispers circulated that it was the Apaches, but James suspected the same outlaw group might be behind it. When James reported the truth to Sheriff Robert Taggart, the lawman frowned gravely. Taggart was a stern man, though not unkind. He listened closely, then rubbed his jaw. "So you're saying we've got a gang of deserters, or criminals posing as cavalry, capturing or killing folks on both sides?" "That's right," James replied. "They already attacked that Apache band. Seems they're rustling stock now. Probably blame it on the tribes, so no one suspects them." Taggart nodded slowly. "We'll have to round up a posse, see if we can track 'em down. But the folks in town, they're ready to blame the nearest tribe. You'll need to tread carefully, Caldwell." James thought of Wilcox, the ranch boss who'd threatened him. "I suppose so." He sighed. "But I'm not going to sit by and watch innocent people suffer." That afternoon, James encountered Wilcox outside the saloon. The ranch boss looked none too pleased to see him. Word had reached him that James had meddled with local savages. "You're a fool," Caldwell Wilcox spat. "You side with them Injuns, you'll find yourself on the wrong side of a rope." "Mark my words," James squared his shoulders. "Try it, Wilcox," he said quietly. "But understand this, I know the truth about who's really stealing cattle and killing folks, and I'll see them brought to justice no matter who's behind it." Wilcox's eyes narrowed. "You watch your back, boy," he hissed before stomping off. Taza, who was standing nearby, gave James a cautioning glance. "Enemies multiply like mosquitoes," he said. "We must be vigilant." Days passed. The sheriff's posse combed the surrounding region for signs of the renegade outlaws. James guided them to the Box Canyon, but the criminals had long since fled. They found only scattered debris, burned wagons, and a few shallow graves. It was clear the gang had relocated. The question was, where meanwhile, tensions in Dustin Falls reached a boiling point. Ranchers demanded swift action. Some called for a punitive expedition against the nearest native camps. Others insisted the sheriff do more to protect their herds. Fear fed anger, and anger fueled thirst for violence. Amid the rising hostility, James discovered a clue. While rummaging through a trunk of old supplies, he found a cavalry patch bearing the insignia of the 7th that he'd taken from one of the outlaws' corpses. It reminded him of men he'd known back in the cavalry, some of whom had deserted after a disastrous campaign. Could this gang be former soldiers turned bandit? He discussed this with Taza and the sheriff. Taggart scratched his chin deep in thought. The 7th had a bad reputation after certain battles in Indian territory. Some men deserted, found themselves on the wrong side of the law. If that's them, they might have allied with other criminals. That means they're well-armed, well-trained. A wave of dread washed over James. Well-trained and desperate spelled danger for everyone. He thought of Painted Rock Mesa of Nyol, her father, and the rest quietly trying to survive in the desert. If these renegades struck again, the outcome would be bloody. Word arrived of another raid. This time a supply wagon headed for Dustin Falls was attacked. The driver was found shot, the goods stolen. Panic spread like wildfire. Ranchers formed their own vigilante groups, ignoring the sheriff's pleas for restraint. James could see it heading toward a full-scale confrontation that would likely scapegoat innocent tribes. One afternoon, Taza rushed to find James. "A messenger from Painted Rock Mesa has come," he said, breathless. "The outlaws returned, kidnapped more people. They want you to come." James felt as though he'd been punched. He ran to the edge of town where a young Apache man waited, trembling. Through Taza's translation, James learned the bandits had ambushed a hunting party near the mesa, capturing 2 men and a young woman. "We have to go," James said, fury and dread twisting inside him. Taza agreed. Sheriff Taggart tried to organize a posse, but the vigilantes led by Wilcox insisted on coming along as well, under the pretense of capturing hostile Injuns. James realized this might turn into a massacre if tensions boiled over. Still, time was short. That evening, James, Taza Taggart, and the posse set off. Wilcox and his men followed, bristling with rifles. James hung back with Taza, exchanging worried looks. This was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. They reached Painted Rock Mesa late at night. The Apache people were wary, seeing so many armed men. Nyol was there, standing near her father, eyes wet and fearful. Her father nodded gravely at James, as if to say, "Thank you for coming." The elder explained through Taza that the outlaws had taken the captives north, likely to a hideout near a place called 3 Pines Gulch. Wilcox scoffed. "Sure they did. Or maybe they're just stalling us while their braves gather to ambush our ranches." James glared at him, fists clenched. The elder remained calm, offering to guide them if Taza and James led the way. Sheriff Taggart, trying to keep peace, agreed. Though Wilcox muttered curses, the group set out before dawn. 3 Pines Gulch was a rugged canyon dotted with stunted pines. By mid-morning, they spotted smoke rising from a hidden hollow. James and the sheriff scouted ahead. Eyes peeled for Outwall. Sure enough, the renegades had set up camp among the rocky slopes. James counted around 15 men. He saw no sign of the captives, but they had to be somewhere inside the gulch. The posse took up positions on a ridge. The Apache warriors from Painted Rock Mesa, about 7 in total, flanked them. An uneasy alliance. Wilcox spat on the ground, ignoring the tension. He wanted a fight. Taggart tried to plan a cautious approach, but Wilcox roared. "They're just men. Let's go in." Guns blazing. Before Taggart could respond, Wilcox fired a shot into the air, announcing their presence. It was a reckless move. The outlaws scattered like rats, grabbing rifles, returning fire. A bullet whizzed past James's ear. Another clipped one of the vigilantes, who went down screaming. Chaos erupted. Wilcox and his men charged down the slope, hollering, leaving Taggart and James cursing. The Apache warriors joined in more strategically, fanning out, taking shots from behind cover. James sprinted behind a boulder, scanning the camp. He spotted a makeshift pen behind some crates. Inside 3 figures were bound, likely the kidnapped men and woman. He signaled to Taza, pointing out the captive's location. The outlaws were dug in, returning fire from behind wagons and rocks. The thunder of gunshots echoed across the gulch. Wilcox charged ahead, wildly, firing at anything that moved. He was so full of rage, he didn't seem to care about the crossfire. James crawled around a boulder, returning fire, aiming carefully. He felled one outlaw who tried to flank them. Taggart's revolver barked, and another criminal went down. The Apache warriors let loose arrows, moving swiftly from cover to cover. In the chaos, James saw an opening. Taza covered him while he sprinted toward the makeshift pen. Bullets kicked up dust around him, but none found their mark. He dove behind a crate, took a breath, and then dashed to the pen. The captives stared at him, eyes wide. He cut their bonds, urging them to stay low. Suddenly, a rifle barrel jammed into James's back. "Drop it!" a harsh voice snarled. James froze, letting his weapon fall. One of the outlaws had snuck around behind him. The man pressed the rifle harder, breath reeking of tobacco. "Think you can rescue these redskins, do you?" Before James could respond, an arrow whistled through the air, striking the outlaw in the shoulder. The rifle fired harmlessly into the ground. The man cried out, stumbling. James seized his chance. He scooped up his dropped pistol and slammed the butt into the outlaw's jaw, knocking him cold. He glanced over his shoulder to see Taza at the edge of the clearing, bow in hand, offering a curt nod. Meanwhile, the firefight raged. Wilcox, ignoring Taggart's orders to coordinate, shot indiscriminately. One of the Apache warriors went down with a bullet wound. Enraged, another warrior vaulted over a fallen tree and fired an arrow that caught Wilcox's horse. The horse reared, throwing Wilcox to the ground. He landed hard, the wind knocked out of him. It all happened fast. The outlaws, seeing their advantage slip away, began to retreat, leaving behind bodies and gear. A handful fled deeper into the gulch. Taggart's men cheered, thinking they'd won. But then came more gunfire from the rear. A second band of outlaws appeared on the ridge, cutting off their exit. Trapped between 2 groups of criminals, the posse panicked. "Take cover!" Taggart yelled, ushering his men behind rocks. The pinned outlaws fired from behind them, effectively sandwiching them in a deadly crossfire. Men on both sides fell, dust clouds swirling. James huddled with Taza, the rescued captives, and a couple of Apache warriors. He scanned the rocky slope, searching for a path out. Then he saw a precarious trail winding around the canyon's edge. It might lead them behind the second group of outlaws. If they could flank them, they might turn the tide. He signaled Taza. Together they led a small group around the perimeter, climbing the rocky path with rifles slung over their shoulders. From this vantage they caught sight of the second outlaw band from above. Unaware they were being flanked, the criminals kept up their barrage at Taggart's pinned men. James and Taza exchanged a look. Then they opened fire from above, picking off the outlaws. Startled shouts echoed below. The outlaws spun around, but it was too late. Taggart's posse, emboldened by the sudden relief, surged forward. Within minutes, the second group of renegades was overrun or fled. When the dust cleared, bodies lay scattered around the gulch. The scorching sun bore witness to the carnage. Taggart took stock of the living. Several vigilantes were dead, along with 2 of the Apache warriors. The outlaws had lost at least 10 men, and a few survivors wounded were taken prisoner. Wilcox bruised from his fall. Cursed the Apaches for his men's deaths, ignoring how his reckless charge had triggered the ambush in the first place. James wanted to shout at him, but one look from Taza told him to save his breath. They freed the kidnapped Apache men and woman, who embraced their rescuers tearfully. One was the husband of the Painted Rock elder's daughter. Relief shone in their eyes. James felt a weary satisfaction, more innocent lives saved. But the cost had been high. The survivors limped back to Painted Rock Mesa. The sheriff's men carried the wounded. The Apache tribe welcomed the returning captives with a mixture of joy and sorrow for the warriors who had died. Prayers and chants filled the night air. James, battered and spent, wanted nothing more than to rest. But as dawn approached, the tribe gathered ceremonially around a newly lit fire. The elder rose, beckoning James to the center. Niole stood beside her father, beaming, her eyes brimming with gratitude. Taza explained quietly that the tribe had decided to present James with a great honor, an ancestral relic signifying protection and unity. It was a beautifully crafted amulet, made of turquoise and silver, etched with sacred symbols. As the elder placed it around James's neck, Taza translated his words. "You have risked your life to save our children, our fathers, our mothers. We honor your bravery. This gift is our gratitude and a sign that you walk with our spirits." Tears threatened to cloud James's vision. He touched the amulet, gently humbled beyond words. It was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of trust and respect between him and a people he once barely knew. The ceremony continued, each member of the band stepping forward to place their hand on James's shoulder or speak a word of thanks. Even the most stoic warriors seemed moved by the magnitude of what he had done. When Niole's turn came, she slipped her hand into his and said simply, "Thank you," in halting English. Never in his life had James felt such warmth in his chest. The amulet seemed to hum against his skin. He knew that no matter where he went or how much time passed, he would forever carry this tribe's gratitude and the memories of this wild, beautiful land in his heart. By midday, Sheriff Taggart and his remaining men prepared to return to Dustin Falls with the outlaw prisoners. Wilcox scowled at the amulet around James's neck, muttering something about Indian trinkets, but the sheriff silenced him with a stern look. Taza planned to stay with the band for a while, helping them rebuild after the traumatic events. James promised to visit again soon. There was a sense of closure in the air. The worst of the renegade threat was quelled. The abducted family members returned. Yet heartbreak lingered for those who had lost their lives. Before departing, James approached Niole and her father. The father offered James a small stone carving, a personal keepsake from his own father. With Taza translating, he said, "Your spirit is strong, brother. May you walk in peace wherever you go." James knelt by Niole, offering her a gentle smile. She stared at him with shining eyes. "Thank you, Jim," she managed in English, hugging him around the neck. He held her for a moment, remembering how small and frightened she'd once been, cornered by wolves on that barren plain. Now she stood among her own safe. As he rode away, the silver turquoise amulet resting against his chest, James knew the West would never feel quite so lonely again. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard the story of how one cowboy's brave choice to save a young girl led to battles against ruthless outlaws and forged an unbreakable bond between strangers. James Caldwell didn't set out to be a hero. He simply followed his conscience. Yet in doing so, he uncovered the courage hidden within us, all the power to protect the vulnerable, to stand against cruelty, and to build bridges of trust across the wide, untamed frontier. If you found meaning in this tale of loyalty, resilience, and hope, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life, reminding us that compassion can triumph over fear, and that every act of kindness can echo across generations. Thank you for listening, and may courage guide all your journeys.